I guess you have a little bit of a chicken and an egg problem there, as I'm sure comes up often in your work.
A chicken and a rooster problem.
A chicken and a rooster problem. And there's some eggs in there too. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Groks Science Show. On today's show, we'll be talking to Dr. Ruben Gur, professor of psychology at the University of Pennsylvania, about a phenomenon that most of us have noticed at some point in our lives: the difference between the male and the female brain. We've got a lot to talk about, so let's get right into it.
My name is Ruben Gur. I studied psychology and philosophy as an undergraduate at Hebrew University of Jerusalem in Israel. Got my PhD at Michigan State University in East Lansing, Michigan, US. Did postdoctoral fellowship, 73, 74 at Stanford. And then 74 came to the University of Pennsylvania in the psychology department. Got involved with imaging, so ended up moving to the School of Medicine. And now I'm in the medical school, professor, and departments. My primary appointment is in psychiatry, and I have secondary appointments in neurology and radiology. And I spend most of the time, most of my day in the belly of the hospital where the scanners are, and studying brain and behavior.
Great. So are gender differences in psychology and neuroscience part of your work, a big part of your work?
Actually, I remember the first time we found a big sex difference, essentially finding that females had about 15 to 20% higher rates of blood flow in the brain. With imaging methods, we can look at the blood. At the blood flow, we can also look at the rate of sugar burning or glucose metabolism using another method. And with that method, that's called PET, or positron emission tomography, we saw that the rate of, unlike blood flow, where females have higher blood flow, if you look at the rate of glucose metabolism, it's identical, males and females, but it differs depending on the brain region. Some regions in a male brain are active, even when they are just resting and don't have any task. And those regions that are active at rest when you're not doing anything, again, are different in males and females. In males, these are all the regions that are in the lower part of the emotional brain, or the limbic system. As you know, with evolution, doesn't throw anything away. It takes the brain of a snake and puts on top of it a brain of a reptile, on top of it a brain of a mammal, on top of it a brain of a primate, and then on top of all that comes our big cortex. But none of the older brains are thrown away. They still are there, pretty much in the same shape and doing the same thing. So it turns out that in the male, all the parts of the older parts of the limbic system, of the emotional brain, are hyperactive when they are resting. Whereas in females, it's the newer part of the limbic system, the cingulate gyrus, which is on top of the corpus callosum and very closely linked to language areas. This is the part of the emotional brain that is more active in women. So that may relate to why women have an easier time talking about emotions. The emotional brain is active right next to the speech area, whereas males, I don't know what they were thinking, but it's pretty primitive parts of the emotional brain are active when you don't give them something to do.
I see. So what are those areas doing at rest? I mean, what would that equate to in terms of what somebody's think? Is it equated to what someone's thinking about, or?
It's an interesting question when psychologists, especially, but most scientists like to take an active role in their study. And we have a hard time tolerating the thought that we'll put somebody in the scanner and just let them sit there. We always give them something to do. But we, from the start, felt that we need to have some control condition. And different labs use different control conditions. Our lab, as well as some others, said, well, a control condition has to be control. We just let them sit there, eyes open, and we just don't talk to them, and we don't give them a task. We just ask them to relax. Just sit there, don't do anything, and just don't fall asleep. And it turns out that when you do that, you get a very reproducible pattern of activity. Reproducible in the sense that if you take a person, do it one day, do it next day, do it next month, you get pretty much the same pattern of resting activity. And that there is a characteristic pattern across people, a certain set of regions that become active when you don't have anything to do. And that was a finding that was reported by Mark Rakel from Washington University back in 2000, and was extremely important because it turns out that it is important to know what parts of the brain to activate when you need a task, but it's as important to know to deactivate the brain when you don't have a task. And there are a certain set of regions that they become active when there is no task, and presumably their job is to alert the appropriate regions when a task shows up. And that's called the default mode network, the network that becomes active during default condition, when you're not facing a challenge. Now, what does it mean practically? I mean, what does it mean when you take somebody and you tell them, here you have 10 minutes or 15 minutes to just sit and don't do anything? We're asking you to do anything. Just sit there. I suppose you let your mind wander wherever it may, and looking at the scans and knowing what those parts do, those parts that become active in males and females, one could conclude that females are probably thinking about relationships, how to they may verbalize certain emotions. The cingulate is is really a part of the newer brain. It's fairly complex. It's almost like cortex. Whereas when you leave males by themselves, I don't know, the lower part of the limbic system may be involved with aggression, sex, maybe some sports, but we don't know what these people were thinking about. And at any rate, the psychologists don't really trust introspection. So even if we asked them, we probably couldn't even publish what they would have told us.
Now, let me ask, do these functional kind of physiological differences, like the metabolism, correspond to structural differences or cellular differences? Has that been studied?
So at this stage in the field, we are sort of studying specific modalities in isolation. We are beginning to put together modalities, but this work is really in its infancy, and we're still not quite sure how to do it. There have been methods to measure the brain anatomy using magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI. Initially, MRI was used only to measure anatomy. Now we have procedures that can let you measure blood flow with a modified MRI procedure, and it can let you measure fluctuations in blood flow, both when you are resting and when you are given a task. So in terms of structure, there have been multiple studies by now of using MR, and clearly there are structural sex differences. Firstly, the male brain is larger, proportionate to the larger size of the body. The males are about 13% heavier and about 9% taller, and their brains are about 11% larger, sort of in between. If you now look at the reason the brains are larger is that the box is larger, the cranium is larger. And if you now look at the composition of the brain inside the cranium, there are three types of tissue in the brain, or in the cranium. One is the nerve cells and the close dendrites that surround them. And that stuff looks gray, so it's called gray matter, and consists mostly of protein. Each nerve cell sends a fiber to connect to other cells, and when these fibers are long, they need to be insulated because they send electrical signal in the same way that the electrical company insulates the wires, the electrical wire, when it sends it to long distances. The longer the distance, the thicker the insulation. The electrical company uses rubber, mostly. The brain doesn't have rubber, it uses fat. Fat gets a more respectable name in the brain. It's called myelin. And it surrounds the fibers that connect different neurons or nerve cells. And because fat is white, this part of the brain is called white matter. So we have gray matter, which are the cells, white matter, which are the myelinated fibers. And then, of course, the brain floats in fluid, literally floats. It has fluid all around it and fluid inside it, and that's called cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. With MRI, you can measure the volume of each one of those compartments. What is the volume of the fluid, what is the volume of fat, and what is the volume of proteins in the brain. And there we found another big sex difference. In males, the larger the head, the more you have both gray matter and white matter, and a lot more fluid. In females, the larger the head, the more gray matter you have, whereas the slope for white matter and for fluid is much shallower. So as a result, females on average have about the same volume of gray matter as males. Their brains are disproportionately have disproportionately more nerve cells relative to fibers that connect them.
Hmm.
Um,
So what would it mean to have fewer fibers? How would that kind of manifest?
so each one of those can have different advantages. If you have fewer fibers, then the connection among the regions will be slower. But by the same token, when you have a smaller brain, the you don't need as many myelinated fibers. So if the brain is more compact, you need less fiber connecting them. Um, the having more fluid is good for the males because the fluid, that cerebrospinal fluid, nourishes the brain, but more importantly, protects it. Otherwise, you get a head injury every time you sneeze. Because the back of your head is nice and smooth, but the front has nasty bones right above your eyes. And the front of your brain is sitting right on top of those bones. And so if the brain shakes in the box, without the fluid, it would rub against bones and get damaged. So men are more likely to get into fist fights and that sort of stuff. And so they need more fluid to protect their brains. Uh, when we look across many studies that were done with MRI in males and females, this finding replicates that that females have percent of gray matter, whereas males have more white matter. More recently, we used a variant of MRI that's called diffusion tensor imaging, or DTI. And that method lets you quantify the fibers themselves. So it tells you how much, roughly how much fiber is there in the tissue, how much fat that is layered on fibers is in the particular tissue that you are examining. And that recent study we completed, where we looked at a large sample of almost 1,000 males and females. These were age range of 8 to 21. And what we saw there was that the predominant, the most predominant direction of the fibers in male brains were stayed within the same hemisphere, whereas fibers in the female brains, the majority of them tended to connect between the two hemispheres. So from there, it looks like male brains are optimized to process information rapidly within each hemisphere, especially connecting from the back of the brain to the front of the brain. Whereas in females, the brains are optimized to connect between the two hemispheres. Now, what we know about front and back of the brain is generally the back of the brain is where the information is processed, and the front of the brain is the part that acts on it, that makes you do something with it. So in males, there is a predominance of a connection between processing and action. What we know about the hemispheres is that the left hemisphere is the part of the brain that processes language, that thinks analytically, sequentially, whereas the right hemisphere is more intuitive, does not use language, that uses pictures, sensations. And so from that, it would seem that in females, the thinking part and the intuitive part keep talking to each other, whereas in males, they don't talk to each other that much.
So you just described kind of two maybe higher order phenotypes, language and the connection between intuition and thinking. Are there other examples of known higher order differences that are affected by these kind of basic anatomical differences?
Well, one finding we had was that the hippocampus, which is a structure in the middle of the brain that is part of the temporal lobe, but is well known to be important for memory. Actually, the work of a Canadian neuroscientist, Brenda Milner, has been really pioneering in this area. So the hippocampus, it turns out, is a part that does not shrink in girls and actually begins to grow post-pubescence, whereas in males, as you know, brains grow up until around age 2 or 3, between 2 and 3. After that, it's downhill for the rest of your life. And between the age of 3 and 21, the most dramatic change is the loss of gray matter and the increase of white matter. So you lose cells and you gain fat inside the brain. And that's essentially the process of what we call myelination. And the loss of tissue is called pruning. Basically, parts of the brain that you haven't used by the time you're an adolescent, the brain figures you don't need them, and they will shrivel off and die. If you look at the hippocampus, you see in males it keeps shrinking, and actually the shrinking accelerates post-pubescence. Whereas in females, it stops shrinking at around pubescence and actually begins to grow again following puberty. And it's well known, that's behaviorally, that females have better memory than males, especially verbal memory and face memory. And their memory actually continues, the memory advantage continues to old age. And we have studies in older people that show that females have more dopamine available in the brain, and that dopamine does not deplete as fast as the dopamine in male brains. And to the extent that the dopamine level remains high in females, to that extent their memory will stay intact into old age. So a memory advantage for females has been linked to both the volume of the hippocampus and to the availability of dopamine, which is an important neurotransmitter related to learning.
So, just because you mentioned development, is it known when some of these differences are come about? Like, is it in utero, or does it take until puberty to see them?
So we have studied children. The youngest we have studied, where we looked at sex differences, is about age 8, and by that time, both the behavioral differences and the brain differences can already be seen. That's at age 8. Of course, as you grow older, those differences become larger and more pronounced. So, for example, the predominance of connection within hemisphere in males and between hemisphere in females is barely seen at age 8 to 11, and really shows up between age 11 and 15, age 15 and adulthood. So some of those differences A lot of these differences are there already as young as we can look. But some of them become more accentuated as you go through adolescence and puberty.
Is it thought that they kind of arise from hormonal differences, or is it the sex chromosome thing?
I guess the answer is yes,
Both.
because no, yeah, it's very next to impossible to separate those effects.
Okay.
And probably the chromosome, of course, exerts its effect through neurotransmitters. And estrogen and testosterone are also neurotransmitters in the brain. So it's known, for example, that estrogen promotes cell growth, whereas testosterone kills cells. So it's possible that some of the sex differences that we see in the in the differentiation post-pubescence could be hormonal effect, and most likely are hormonal effect. But that interplay really needs to be studied a lot more. There's evidence that the other evidence that hormones may play a role comes from the work of Stephanie van Goosen and her colleagues in Utrecht in Holland. They have studied children with ambiguous sex. So in America, as you know, your sex is probably the first thing that your mom knows about when she hears that she had a baby. Look, what a beautiful girl, boy. But sometimes the doctor gets stuck. You have cases where the sex is ambiguous. You have a very small penis that you're not sure whether it's really a penis or a clitoris, and vice versa. And people are born with ambiguous sex, and basically at some point they have to decide. The parents have to decide whether they are going to raise a girl or a boy. In America, the decision is mostly made by the surgeon, whichever surgery seems easier. But there are a lot of unhappy people. And Hopkins, where the surgery took place, these surgeries were taking place, has been sued by people who said, I feel like I'm a male and you made me into a woman, and vice versa. In Holland, they have a big center in Utrecht where these kids are evaluated and studied, and they look at their preferences. Do they like to play with trucks or do they like to play with dolls? And then when it is clear what sex the kid sort of is tending toward, then they will start hormonal treatment in the direction of that sex. And they have studied those children, and they found that when you masculinize a child like that, when you feminize a child, then they found that their verbal fluency goes up, their memory improves. On the other hand, their spatial skills go down. Whereas when you feminize male to female, transsexual, their spatial skills improve, but their verbal skills go down and they become your typical grunting male. So that's definitely hormonal. These treatments were hormonal.
So I want to make sure we get to this. I know you've done some work on it, and I think it's really an interesting topic. The kind of differences in susceptibility for mental illness between males and females. What's known about that?
Well, male brains are different from female brains in health, and it's not too surprising. that they are different in illness. In broad strokes, uh, males are more susceptible to illnesses that influence the fight-flight axis, anger and fear. So there are many more males who are oppositional defiant, psychopath, autism, schizophrenia. If you look at aggressive behavior, physical aggression, males and females look like two different species. As you may know, they have close to 1,000 people on death row in California. I believe there are only 13 females among them. It's totally disproportionate. If you don't need to do research, just open this morning's paper, and if somebody beat somebody up or inflicted physical injury on somebody else and you're betting it's a male, you'll be right something like 40,000 to 1. On the other hand, females are much more susceptible to diseases that influence the happy-sad dimensions of emotion. They are much more vulnerable to depression, mostly. Depression is a female illness. The ratio is much higher in females. They're also more prone to eating disorders, and that's basically it. So depression, eating disorder, anxiety disorders, whereas males are, anxiety disorders is less pronounced, definitely depression and eating disorders. Males are more likely to suffer from psychosis, autism, oppositional defiant personality disorders, explosive disorder. I mean, disorders related to anger.
I see. Let me ask you, from your own perspective, do you see a lot of these differences as kind of shifts in the distribution, kind of shifts in the mean? And there's some people that are, there's some, like, is there ever a chance you would look at a female brain, look at the structure in the MRI or PET scan and say it's male because there's some overlap in the distribution?
Absolutely. No, everything I talked about averages, and I don't think I can emphasize it enough. And if you think of it more like sex differences in height and weight. That's roughly the order of magnitude of the effect that we see here. So you know that on average, females are lighter and shorter. But of course, you can easily think of some females who are taller and heavier than most males that you know, and you can think of some males that are shorter and lighter than many females. So we're talking definitely about averages.
Okay. I see that I have to let you go in a couple of minutes here, but I do want to ask you one last question. So what would you say the most accurate kind of generalization that you've heard about? You hear all kinds of generalizations. I just heard systemizing versus empathizing.
Right.
And it sounds like there's some merit to some of those. What would you say the most accurate one is?
Geez, that's a tough one. You're asking what would be a way to a dimension of sex difference that I believe is correct and accurate. Males are blah and females are.
What dimension do you feel like if you could would capture the most variability between the sexes?
I think it depends on what you are using as a yardstick for a difference. And a standard for a difference in science is effect size. So which behavior could I take that males are very likely to engage in, whereas females are very unlikely to engage in? I think that will have to be physical aggression.
Okay. Okay.
Men are physically aggressive, whereas males are physically aggressive, whereas females can be aggressive, but not physically. Of course, there are conditions under which females will also be physically aggressive, but it's as rare to find a female who engages in physical aggression as it is to find a male who does not, or who never has. Let me put it this way. I mean, I don't get into fist fight anymore at my age, but, growing up, it did happen.
Sure. Sure. Well, thank you so much for this. This has been really interesting. Is there any kind of final thing you want to say about your work or anything?
Well, this part of my work, the sex differences is part of what I do, but I think it's very important because I'm really concerned about the state of the relationship between males and females in the world. If you were a Martian looking from up there, you would think that these are, if you think of it as two nations fighting each other, then what we have is nothing short of genocide being performed as we speak. And on the other hand, if you look for a simple definition of how advanced a particular society is, a simple yardstick is the extent to which males and females are treated equally. I think the future of civilization depends on how fast females can seize equal power, because until they do, we're not going in good direction. I don't think there's been a war, a day in the history without a war, and I'm absolutely sure that would change once the sexes share power more equally.
All right. Once again, that was Dr. Ruben Gur, professor of psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. Thanks everyone for joining us today, and tune in next week for more from the world of science and technology. For Charles Lee Frankling and the rest of the Groks crew, I'm Samantha Thomas. Have a great afternoon and keep on grokking.